Josephine Calloway stood in the middle of Larkspur's dusty main street. Her hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms, while half the town gathered to watch Colt Bryant kneel before her in the dirt. He held up a ring that caught the afternoon sun. Josie did not look at it. She looked past his shoulder, past the crowd, all the way down the street to the blacksmith's forge, where smoke rose steady and slow. "A cowboy will win your heart one day, Josephine." Her mother had told her 100 times. Josie's voice did not shake. "I'd rather it be a blacksmith," she said, and turned her back on the only proposal this town ever thought a girl like her would get. Before we go any further, if a story like this one stirs something in you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end, because this story is far from over. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Colt Bryant did not move from his knees right away. He stayed there in the dust, with the ring held up like he expected the whole street to correct her for him, like Josie's answer had been a mistake somebody would fix before it counted. "Say that again," he said. "You heard me the first time, Colt." "You'd rather have the blacksmith." He said it slow, like he was tasting something sour. "Caleb Morgan, the fella who smells like coal smoke and sweats over an anvil for wages. I'd rather have a man who never once made me feel small," Josie said, "than a man who's asking me to marry him in front of the whole town so everybody can watch me say yes." A ripple went through the crowd. Somebody's breath caught. Prudence Sutter, standing near the mercantile steps with her gloved hands folded over her belly, leaned toward Mabel Finch and didn't bother lowering her voice. "Well, I never," Prudence said. Turning down Colt Bryant, "That girl ought to get down on her knees and thank the Lord anybody asked her at all." Mabel nodded like a woman agreeing with scripture. "Best offer she'll ever see, and she's throwing it in the dirt." Josie heard every word. She always heard every word. Years of standing in rooms where women spoke about her like she was a piece of furniture too heavy to move had taught her how to keep her face still while her insides went to war. Colt finally stood brushing the dust from his knee with more temper than the dust required. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrow, and for one moment the charm the whole county loved him for slipped clean off his face. "You'll regret this," he said, quiet enough that only she and the few folks closest could hear it. "You think anybody else is lining up? You think there's a line of men waiting on a girl your size?" "Josephine, I was doing you a kindness." Josie's chest burned, but she did not look away from him. "A kindness isn't something a man announces to a whole street so everyone can watch a woman say yes or be humiliated. That's not kindness, Colt. That's a performance." "Watch your mouth," he snapped. "I'll speak how I please. You already made your choice plain enough for the whole town to hear it. I reckon I'm allowed to make mine." Her mother, Ruth Calloway, pushed through the gathering with her hand pressed to her chest, like she might faint clean away. "Josephine and Calloway, you apologize to Mr. Bryant this instant." "I won't, Mama. You will humiliate this family in the middle of the street." "I already did that," Josie said. "The moment I said no in front of everybody. I don't reckon apologizing changes what's already been seen." That was when a voice cut through the murmuring crowd, low, and even the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "Seems to me the lady gave her answer plain enough. No cause to keep asking her to give it twice." Every head turned. Caleb Morgan stood at the edge of the gathering with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and soot still dark on his forearms from the forge. He hadn't hurried over. He'd walked unhurried like a man who'd already decided what he was going to say before he got there. He stopped a few feet from Colt and looked at him steady, not unkind, not cruel, just steady, the way a man looks at another man when he's finished being patient. Colt's mouth twisted. "This ain't your business, Morgan." "Wasn't asking your permission to make it mine." Caleb touched the brim of his hat toward Josie, a small gesture quick, but she saw it, and something in her chest that had been clenched all afternoon loosened half an inch. "Ma'am." "Mr. Morgan," Josie managed. Colt looked between them, and something ugly crossed his face, something that had been sitting under his charm the whole time waiting for a reason to show itself. "This makes sense to anybody else. The girl turns down me for him." He laughed short and hard. Boy shoes, horses for a living. I do, Caleb said, and I ain't ashamed of it. Should be. Man your age, no land, no name worth mentioning, still hammering iron like a hired hand. Colt. That was Thomas Calloway, Josie's father, arriving late and out of breath, having come from the store. The second word reached him. He put himself between his daughter and the two men without quite meaning to, the way a father does without thinking about it. That's enough, all of it. This is my daughter you're discussing, like she's cattle at auction, and I won't stand for it. Mr. Calloway, all due respect, your daughter just humiliated me in front of half the county. My daughter, Thomas said, gave you an honest answer to a question you asked in a place where you knew half the county would be watching. If you wanted a private answer, you ought to have asked a private question. Colt's jaw worked. He looked at Josie one more time, and whatever softness might have once lived behind his eyes when he looked at her was gone now, burned off like morning fog. Fine, he said. Marry the blacksmith. See how far that gets you in this town. He turned on his heel and walked off. Boots hard against the packed dirt, and the crowd began to break apart, the way crowds do when the show is over, murmuring low to each other, glancing back at Josie like she was something that had happened to the street rather than a woman standing in it. Prudence Sutter didn't bother lowering her voice as she passed. Poor thing. She'll be sorry. She already looks sorry, Mabel added, and the two women laughed, the soft, cutting laugh of people who have never once had to stand where Josie was standing. Ruth grabbed her daughter's arm, fingers digging in. Do you have any idea what you just did, Colt Bryant? His father owns half the cattle contracts between here and Abilene. You could have had a house, Josephine, security, a name that means something in this town. I don't want his name, Mama. You don't want anybody's name, apparently, except a blacksmith's. And what does that get you? A man who works with his hands for wages, who'll never own more than that little forge and the roof over it. Ruth. Thomas's voice was quiet, but it stopped her cold. Let's take this home. Ruth's mouth pressed into a thin line, but she let her husband guide her away, still throwing one more look back at her daughter, a look that said this conversation was only beginning, not ending. Josie stood alone in the thinning crowd for a moment, her heart still hammering her face hot, despite the breeze. She became aware slowly that Caleb hadn't left. He stood a respectful distance off, hat in his hands now, instead of on his head, turning the brim over between his fingers, like a man who wanted to say something and hadn't decided whether he had the right to. You didn't have to do that, she said. Didn't have to, he agreed. Wanted to. Colt's going to make trouble for you. His father's got half this town on a payroll or a note. I've had trouble before. Caleb's voice was even unbothered, the voice of a man who genuinely did not seem to care what Colt Bryant or his father could do to him. Wasn't going to stand there and let him talk to you that way, trouble or not. Josie looked at him properly, then maybe for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. He had a weathered kind of handsomeness, sun and work carved into his face, rather than given to him easy dark hair, pushed back where he'd raked a hand through it, shoulders built by years of swinging a hammer, rather than years of sitting a horse for show. He didn't look at her the way Colt had looked at her, like he was doing her a favor by looking at all. He just looked at her like she was a person standing in front of him. Why'd you say it? Caleb asked. In front of everybody. You could have turned him down quiet later. He didn't ask me quiet. No, Caleb allowed. He didn't. I've spent my whole life being quiet about things people said about me, Josie said, and she surprised herself with how steady her voice came out. I decided a while back that if the town's going to talk about me either way, I might as well be the one who gets to say something true while they're doing it. Something shifted in Caleb's face. Something that might have been respect, or might have been the beginning of something he wasn't ready to name yet either. That's a fine way to live, Miss Calloway. Josie, she said, everybody in this town's earned the right to call me Josephine when they're scolding me. You didn't scold me. You can call me Josie. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one. Josie then. Caleb. I know your name, Mr. Morgan. Figured you might. Wasn't sure you'd use it. She almost smiled at that almost before the weight of the afternoon settled back over her shoulders, and she remembered where she was standing, and what had just happened, and how many windows in this town had watched it happen through their curtains. I should get back to the store. My father'll need help closing up, and my mother's going to want to finish telling me what a fool I am. You ain't a fool, Caleb said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. He said it the way a man states a fact he's sure of, like the weather or the price of nails. Then he put his hat back on, touched the brim again, and said, "Evening, Josie," and walked back toward the forge like the whole exchange hadn't cost him anything at all. Josie watched him go longer than she meant to. The Calloway house sat 2 streets back from the Mercantile, small and neat, with her father's careful hand visible in every mended fence post and freshly painted shutter. Supper that night was quiet in the way that meant everyone in the room had a great deal to say, and was choosing for the moment not to say it. Ruth set the plates down harder than necessary. Thomas ate without looking up. Josie pushed her food around and waited for the storm she knew was coming. It came before the second helping. "I raised you better than to humiliate a good family in the middle of the street," Ruth said, setting down her fork. "You raised me to tell the truth, Mama." That's what I told him. The truth can be told in a parlor, privately, not paraded in front of Prudence Sutter and half of Larkspur County. He proposed in front of Prudence Sutter and half of Larkspur County, Josie said. I didn't choose the stage, I only refused to lie on it. Ruth's hands trembled around her napkin. Do you understand what you gave up today? A man like Colt Bryant doesn't come along twice for a girl like... She stopped herself, but not fast enough. A girl like me, Josie finished quietly. Go on and say it, Mama. You've said it before. Might as well say it plain at your own supper table. I only meant... You meant that I'm fat, and this town's decided that means I ought to be grateful for whatever attention comes my way, no matter how it's given or what it costs me. Josie's voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. I've heard it my whole life from women in this town, from boys who wouldn't dance with me at socials, from you more times than you'd probably like to count if you sat down and did the counting. I'm tired of being grateful for scraps, Mama. I'd rather be alone than married to a man who thinks marrying me is charity. Thomas set his fork down. Ruth. Don't Ruth me, Thomas. Somebody in this house has to think about her future. What happens when we're gone? When there's no store to run and no roof over her head that we're paying for. A woman needs a husband who can provide Josephine, and men like Caleb Morgan are hard-working, honest, and kind, Thomas said, and the table went still. I've known that man 3 years. He's never once shorted me on a debt, never once spoken ill of anybody in this town, even when they've spoken ill of him, and he just stood up in the middle of the street today for our daughter, when nobody else in this family managed to get there in time to do it ourselves. He looked at his wife steady. I'd take a man like that for a son-in-law over Colt Bryant's father's cattle contracts any day of the week, and I'll thank you not to speak against him at my table. Ruth's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at her husband like she barely recognized him, and then she looked at her daughter, and something in her hardened face flickered, not quite softening, but shifting like a door easing off a rusted hinge. It hadn't moved on in years. I only want her taken care of, Ruth said, finally quieter now. I don't want her to end up alone the way I nearly did before your father. I know, Mama. Josie reached across the table, and after a moment, Ruth let her take her hand. But I'd rather be alone than spend my life next to a man who married me like he was settling for something. I've been settled for my whole life. I want somebody who chooses me. Nobody said anything else about it that night. But later, lying awake in the dark, with the sound of her father's fiddle drifting faint from the porch, Josie thought about the way Caleb Morgan had said her name. Not Miss Calloway, not the fat girl from the store, just Josie. And she thought for the first time in a long while that maybe wanting to be chosen wasn't the same thing as being foolish. 2 streets over the forge had gone cold for the night, but Caleb Morgan sat outside it on an overturned crate, a cup of coffee gone lukewarm in his hands, staring at nothing in particular. His old friend, Ezra Whitfield, who ran the livery next door, leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and a look on his face like a man settling in to say something he'd been holding on to for a while. "You made yourself an enemy today," Ezra said. "Wasn't trying to make a friend of him before either. Colt Bryant's daddy holds the note on half this street, Caleb, including yours. I know whose note I hold. Then you know what it means stepping in front of his boy in the middle of Main Street in front of God and everybody." Caleb turned the coffee cup in his hands, slow. What was I supposed to do? Ezra stand there and let him talk to her like that? I ain't saying you were wrong. I'm saying you ought to know what it might cost you. I know what it costs to stay quiet too, Caleb said, and something in his voice went low and rough in a way that made Ezra go still. I did that once. Stood by and stayed quiet when I should have said something, should have done something. And a man I loved paid for my quiet with his life. I ain't doing that again. Not for a note on a forge, not for anything. Ezra didn't ask him to say more. He'd known Caleb long enough to know which door not to knock on, and the stampede that took Caleb's younger brother 3 years back on a cattle drive, neither of them ever talked about outright, was a door that stayed shut most days. Caleb had walked off the trail after that, and never sat a horse for wages again, took up the hammer instead. Like a man could build something solid enough out of iron to make up for something he hadn't been able to hold on to out on the open range. "She's a fine woman," Ezra said instead after a while. "Calloway's girl." "She is." "Whole town's going to talk." "Whole town already talks," Caleb said. "About her size, about her prospects, about whatever they please morning and night, whether I say 2 words to her or 200. I don't reckon my silence was ever buying her any peace. Might as well not be silent for nothing." Ezra huffed something like a laugh. That almost sounded like a man working up to courting somebody. Caleb didn't answer that directly. He looked down the dark street toward the Calloway house, toward the small square of lamplight still burning in an upstairs window, and something in his chest, something that had been banked low and careful for 3 long years, stirred like coals under fresh air. "Get some sleep, Ezra," was all he said. The next morning brought Josie down Main Street earlier than usual, sent by her father with a list of nails and hinges the store needed, and more pointedly, an errand to the forge that Thomas Calloway had invented out of thin air the moment he saw an opportunity to give his daughter a reason to walk in that direction, without anyone accusing him of matchmaking. Caleb was already at the anvil when she arrived, sleeves rolled a horseshoe glowing orange under his hammer sparks, scattering with each strike. He didn't stop working right away, though she saw the moment he noticed her, a small shift in his shoulders, a beat missed in his rhythm, before he found it again. "Morning," she said over the ring of the hammer. He set the tongs down, wiped his hands on his apron, and the hammer went quiet. "Morning, Josie. Didn't expect you down this early. Papa needs hinges. Says the storeroom door's been sticking." She held up the list a little sheepish. "I suspect he also just wanted an excuse to send me somewhere he figured I'd want to go." "Your father's a smart man. He's a meddling man. There's a difference, though. I love him for it either way." She stepped closer to the workbench, looking over the tools laid out with careful precision, the half-finished pieces waiting their turn. "I never asked what all you make down here besides horseshoes." "Whatever folks need. Hinges, nails, wagon wheels, tools. Fixed Widow Tanner's stove grate last month for nothing but a plate of her biscuits, and I'd call that a fair trade any day." Josie laughed, and the sound surprised her light and easy in a way laughter hadn't felt in a long while. "You undercharge half this town. I get by?" Caleb reached for a small burlap sack on the shelf behind him and set it on the workbench between them. "Made you something. Wasn't sure I'd ever get around to giving it to you until yesterday made it seem like maybe I ought to stop waiting." She opened it carefully. Inside was a small iron horseshoe, no bigger than her palm, polished smooth, with a tiny flower worked into the curve of it, delicate for something made of something so hard and unforgiving. "I don't have call to make pretty things mostly," Caleb said, a little rough, like he wasn't used to explaining himself. "Folks want a shoe that holds a horse steady, not one that looks like anything. But I had some time one evening, and I got to thinking on you, and it came out looking like that. Josie turned it over in her hands, throat tight in a way she hadn't expected. Why me? You hardly know me, Caleb. We've spoken maybe a dozen words to each other before yesterday. Don't reckon knowing somebody's got much to do with how many words you've traded with them, Caleb said. I've watched you 3 years, Josie. Watched you carry sacks of flour twice your size, 'cause you wouldn't ask a customer to wait on your daddy. Watched you sit with old Mrs. Finch every Sunday after her husband passed, even though her daughter Mabel's never had a kind word to say about you in her life. Watched you keep your chin up walking down this street no matter what got said behind your back or in front of your face. I know plenty about you. Just never had a reason before yesterday to say so out loud. Ishibo atain y'all. Josie's eyes burned, and she blinked hard against it, not wanting to cry in the middle of a blacksmith shop with the whole street liable to walk by any minute. That might be the kindest thing anybody said to me in this town in a good long while. Then this town's been doing you a disservice, Caleb said simply, and I aim to correct that if you'll let me. Before she could answer, the shop door creaked and Ezra leaned in with a look of poorly disguised delight at what he'd clearly interrupted. Sorry to break this up, but Caleb, you've got a fella out here asking after you. Says he's from the bank. Caleb's face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes went careful alert the way a man's does when he's been half expecting bad news and it's finally arrived on schedule. Tell him I'll be right out. Josie looked between the two men. Is everything all right? It's fine, Caleb said, though the set of his jaw said it might not stay that way. Reckon Mr. Bryant heard about yesterday, same as everybody else in this town did. Caleb, go on and take your hinges to your father Josie, ain't your trouble to carry. But he said it gently, and he reached out just for a moment and closed her hand around the little iron horseshoe still sitting in her palm. Keep that whatever else happens today. I made it before I knew what it'd cost me to give it to you, and I don't regret the giving not one bit. Josie didn't leave. She followed him as far as the doorway, close enough to see the man waiting out front, not a bank clerk, but Silas Bryant himself. Colt's father, dressed too fine for a street that smelled of coal smoke and horse sweat. Mr. Bryant, Caleb said, even unhurried. Don't recall an appointment. Didn't need one to walk down my own street, Morgan. Silas's eyes flicked past Caleb to Josie standing in the doorway, something cold moving behind them, before he looked back to Caleb. Heard some interesting talk yesterday. My son, Miss Calloway, you. Then you heard it plain enough, I expect. Don't reckon I need to repeat it. You've got a note with my bank, Morgan. $200 against this shop due in full come spring. Silas said it mild like a man rehearsing something to sound offhand. I'd hate for anything to complicate the terms of that arrangement. Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. That note's been paid on time every month for 2 years, Mr. Bryant. Ain't a payment late, ain't a term broken. Don't reckon my business with Miss Calloway has any bearing on a debt that's got nothing to do with her. Everything in this town has bearing on everything else, son. That's how towns work. Silas stepped closer, lowering his voice, like the words were a kindness he did him by not saying them louder. My boy's humiliated. My name's been dragged through the dirt on Main Street by a blacksmith and a fat girl who ought to have known better than to think she had room to be particular. I could call that note early if I had a mind to. Could make it awful hard on you come spring, if my mind bent that direction. The word landed on Josie like a slap, and her whole body went rigid in the doorway. But before she could open her mouth, Caleb spoke first, and there was nothing careful left in his voice at all. You'll speak of her with respect, Mr. Bryant, or you won't speak of her in front of me again. His voice hadn't risen, but it had gone hard as the iron on his anvil. As for that note, call it early if that's the kind of man you want this town to know you for. I'll find the money somehow, or I'll lose this shop and start again with nothing same as I did once before. Either way, I'll sleep easy, knowing I didn't stand quiet while a man like you talked about a woman like her as if she wasn't standing 10 feet away with ears that work fine. Silas's face went red, then careful again, the practiced calm of a man used to getting his way, settling back over his features. You're a fool, Morgan. Maybe so. Wouldn't be the first time somebody's called me that for doing what I thought was right instead of what was easy. After a long moment, it was Silas, who looked away, first straightening his coat like the conversation had gone exactly the way he'd intended, though nobody standing there believed that for a second. "Spring," Silas said one more time, like a threat wearing the clothes of a reminder, and turned back toward the bank, his boots too polished for the dust they kicked up. Ezra let out a low whistle once he was well out of earshot. "Well, that's spring ruined for you." "Wasn't looking forward to it much anyway," Caleb said. But Josie saw the way his hand had curled into a fist at his side, and only now slowly was letting go. She crossed to him before she could talk herself out of it. "You didn't have to say any of that. Not for me." "Already told you once." Caleb said, some of the hardness easing out of his face when he looked at her. "Wasn't asking permission that time either." "He could take your shop, Caleb. Over this. Over me. He could try." Caleb looked down at her hand still closed around the little iron horseshoe, and something in his expression settled certain the way a man looks when he's already made peace with a cost before anybody's asked him to pay it. "I've built this shop up from nothing once before, with my own 2 hands, and I can do it again if it comes to that. What I won't do is stand quiet while a man like Silas Bryant, or his son, or anybody in this town, decides they've got the right to make you feel small for existing exactly as you are. I lost somebody once because I stayed quiet when it mattered. I don't aim to make that mistake twice, whatever it costs me." Josie looked up at him, the horseshoe warm now from the heat of her own hand. Her heart caught somewhere between fear for what was coming and a feeling she hadn't let herself name in a very long while, but one that felt for the first time in years like it might be worth the risk of naming it all. "Well then, Mr. Morgan," she said, quiet, steady, a small smile finding its way onto her face, despite everything the morning had cost them both. "I reckon you'd better teach me how a body goes about helping keep a forge running come spring, in case it comes to that." Caleb looked at her a long moment, and for the first time since she'd known him, something that was unmistakably a full smile broke across his weathered face. "I reckon I'd like that just fine, Josie." Behind them down the street, the bank's front door shut with a sound like a decision being made, and neither one of them knew yet how much that closed door was going to cost them before the summer was through, only that whatever was coming, they didn't intend to face it alone. Josie carried her father's hinges back to the store, with the little iron horseshoe still warm in her apron pocket, and she found Thomas behind the counter, sleeves rolled counting the till with more care than the till usually got. He looked up when the bell over the door rang, and whatever he saw on her face made him set the coins down. "You look like you've been standing too close to a fire," he said. "I have been in a manner of speaking." She set the sack of hinges on the counter and told him the bank clerk who wasn't a clerk. Silas Bryant's coat too fine for the street. The note on Caleb's shop, the word spring said like a blade held to a man's throat. Thomas's face didn't change the way she expected. It went still instead, and something behind his eyes she'd never seen before crept in, not surprise. Recognition. "Papa?" "Sit down, Josie." "I don't want to sit down. I want to know why you're looking at me like that." Thomas rubbed a hand over his jaw, the way he did when he was deciding how much truth a moment could hold. "This store carries a note with the Bryant Bank, too. Has for 6 years since the winter your mother's chest took sick and the doctor's bills near buried us. I've paid it faithful same as Caleb's paid his, but a note's a note, and a bank that wants to call one early can find a reason if it wants one bad enough." The floor seemed to tilt under Josie's feet. "You never told me. Wasn't your burden to carry. Still might not come to anything." But his voice didn't sound like a man who believed his own comfort, and Josie had known her father's voice her whole life well enough to hear the difference between what he hoped and what he feared. "If Silas Bryant is angry enough to threaten Caleb over a proposal that never had anything to do with money," Josie said slowly, "what's stopping him from being angry enough to come after us too?" Thomas didn't answer that. He didn't have to. The silence between them answered it plainly enough, and Josie stood in the middle of the store with the horseshoe growing heavier in her pocket than any piece of iron that size had a right to be. Word moved through Larkspur the way it always did, fast and cruel, and rearranged a dozen times by the time it reached the far end of the street. By Thursday, 3 days after the proposal, Josie had heard 4 different versions of what happened in front of the mercantile, none of them true, all of them unkind. In one telling, she'd wept and begged Colt's forgiveness before running off. In another, she'd struck him. In the one Prudence Sutter was telling at the church social committee meeting, Josie had been led astray by a blacksmith who'd turned her head with sweet talk because he knew a plain girl was easy pickings for a man with no prospects of his own. Josie heard that one secondhand from her friend Nettie Voss, who ran the boarding house, and had never once in her life bitten her tongue for propriety's sake. Plain, Nettie said, snorting into her tea. As if you were ever plain a day in your life. Prudence Sutter wouldn't know a kind man if he built her a house with his bare hands, which, come to think of it, is about what Caleb Morgan's fixing to do for half this town for free, if folks keep bringing him their broken things and paying him in biscuits. It's not funny, Nettie. No, Nettie agreed, sobering. It ain't, but you didn't do anything wrong, Josie. And I'll not sit here and let you talk yourself into believing otherwise just because Prudence Sutter's got nothing better to do than run her mouth. Josie wanted to believe that. Some mornings she did. Other mornings, walking to the forge with an errand her father had once again invented, she caught the way certain doors along Main Street seemed to close, a beat too quickly when she passed. The way certain voices dropped low and then picked up again once she'd gone by. And she wondered whether telling a hard truth in front of a whole town was worth what it was costing everyone she loved. Then she'd reach the forge, and the doubt would burn off like morning fog the second Caleb looked up from the anvil and said her name like it was a plain and simple fact he was glad of. "You're getting good at that," he told her one afternoon watching her work the bellows, her arms aching pleasantly from the effort, sweat at her temples. Her sleeves pushed up past her elbows in a way her mother would have called unladylike, and Caleb had never once remarked on, except to say the fire needed more air, and she was giving it exactly that. "I had a fine teacher. Had a stubborn student is more like it. Most folks quit complaining about their arms after the first hour. You're on day 4. "I don't quit things," Josie said, and something in the way she said it made Caleb go quiet for a moment. Tongs still in his hand, looking at her with an expression she was starting to learn, the one that meant he was turning her words over in his head, like he did a piece of iron before he decided how to shape it. "No," he said finally. "I don't reckon you do." He showed her how to hold a hammer so the swing came from her shoulder instead of her wrist. How to read the color of heated iron to know when it was ready to work. How to shape a simple hook out of a length of scrap. Her first attempt came out crooked, and she laughed at it. An honest, unguarded laugh that made 2 ranch hands passing by glance in through the open doorway, curious, and Caleb didn't seem to notice or care that they did. "It's ugly," she said, holding up the hook. "It's yours," Caleb said. "First thing you ever made with your own hands. Ain't ugly. It's a beginning." He took it from her, turned it over, then set it on a shelf near the door, where she could see later that it sat among a handful of other small, first-made objects, a nail, a bent horseshoe. Things she guessed belonged to him, kept for reasons he hadn't explained. "What are those?" "Things I made when I was starting out. My uncle taught me the trade down in Bazar County, before I ever thought about cattle or trails or any of it. Kept the first pieces I ever made bad as they were. Reminds a man where he started some days when he's forgotten how far he's come." "You never talk about before," Josie said carefully. "Before you came to Larkspur." Something crossed his face, quick gone before she could name it fully. "Not much worth telling. Ezra says different. Says there's a reason you don't sit a horse anymore, even though half this town says you used to ride better than any man in the county." Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly, and for a moment Josie thought she'd pushed somewhere she shouldn't have. Then he set down his hammer, and when he spoke, his voice had gone low and careful, the voice of a man handling something sharp. "Had a brother, younger than me by 4 years, Daniel." He said the name like it still cost him something to say it out loud. "We rode the same outfit 3 summers running driving cattle up from the Nueces to the railheads. 3rd summer we hit a storm 2 days out from Dodge. Cattle spooked. Whole herd came apart in the dark, and Daniel's horse went down under him." Caleb's hands, still and steady a moment ago, had curled into fists at his sides. I was 50 yards off when it happened. Could have been closer. Should have been closer. I was riding drag that night instead of point on account of I'd asked to switch places with another hand who wanted a better view of the stars, if you can believe something that small being the reason. By the time I got to him, he stopped. Josie didn't fill the silence. She'd learned in 4 days, at his side, that Caleb Morgan was not a man who needed the quiet rushed. He didn't make it, Caleb said finally. I carried him 2 miles to the wagon myself, and it didn't matter, and I never sat a horse for wages again after we buried him. Took up the hammer instead. Iron don't spook. Iron don't run off in the dark and take somebody with it. I reckon that's a foolish reason to change a man's whole life, but there it is. Josie crossed the space between them without deciding to, and put her hand over his closed fist, feeling it slowly loosen under her palm. It's not foolish. Told myself for a long while it was penance. Caleb said quiet now, looking at her hand on his rather than at her face. Like if I stayed quiet enough, worked hard enough, didn't ask for anything, maybe I'd earn back something I lost out there in the dark. Didn't work mostly. Just made me lonely. He looked up at her then, and whatever was in his eyes made her breath catch. Until here lately. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The forge ticked and settled behind them, and somewhere outside, a wagon rattled past. And Josie thought, not for the first time that week, that she had never in her whole life felt as entirely seen as she did. Standing in a blacksmith shop with soot on her hands, and her heart hammering harder than it had any right to over a man who hadn't even kissed her yet. He didn't kiss her that day either, but he held her hand a moment longer than the moment strictly required, and when he finally let go, something had shifted between them that both of them understood without needing to name it out loud. That shift did not go unnoticed by the rest of Larkspur. By the second week, 3 of Caleb's regular customers had quietly taken their business to the smith over in Millbrook, a full day's ride each way, rather than bring their horses to a man the Bryant family had made clear they were displeased with. Old Jed Ainsley, who'd had every plow blade on his farm sharpened by Caleb for the better part of a decade, stopped by the forge looking like a man walking to his own funeral. "I'm sorry, son," Jed said, not meeting Caleb's eyes. "You've done right by me every time I've walked through that door, and I want you to know it ain't about the work. Bryant's bank holds my mortgage. His boy come by my place personal made it plain what he expected of folks who wanted to stay in his father's good graces. I understand, Jed. Do you?" Jed finally looked up, and there was real shame in his face. "'Cause I don't rightly understand it myself. Man ought to be able to choose who sharpens his plow without a banker's son telling him different." "Man's got a family to feed," Caleb said, and there was no bitterness in it, which somehow made it worse to hear. "I won't hold it against you, Jed. Go on to Millbrook. I'll still tip my hat to you Sunday." Jed left looking no better for having said his piece, and Caleb stood in the doorway of his shop, a long while after watching the empty street, and Josie arriving 20 minutes later with a jar of preserves her mother had sent over a small cautious olive branch that Ruth herself hadn't fully explained, found him still standing there. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough." Caleb didn't try to soften it for her, which she was grateful for, even as it made her chest ache. "Lost near half my regular custom this past week. Fellas who've traded with me for years all of a sudden finding reasons to ride further and pay more for the privilege. Because of me. Because of a man who can't stand being told no," Caleb corrected, gentle but firm. "That's a different thing entirely. Josie and I won't have you carrying blame that belongs to him." But the guilt sat in her chest anyway, heavy as a stone, and it grew heavier 3 days later when her mother came to find her at the forge the first time Ruth Calloway had set foot near the place, her face pale, her hands wringing the fabric of her skirt. "Mr. Bryant came by the store," Ruth said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Silas himself. Wanted to speak with your father alone." Josie's stomach dropped. "What did he want?" "I don't know exactly. Your father won't say. But he came out of that back room looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 10 minutes, and when I asked him what was said, all he'd tell me was that some things a father has to carry so his daughter doesn't have to." Ruth's voice cracked just slightly. An unfamiliar sound from a woman who prided herself on never cracking in front of anyone. Josephine, I need you to tell me plainly, is this whatever this is, with the blacksmith worth what it might cost this family? Caleb, who had gone quiet and still at the edge of the conversation, set down his tools. Mrs. Calloway, if it eases your mind any, I'd step back from your daughter myself before I'd let harm come to your family on my account. I mean that plain and honest. No, Josie said sharper than she intended, and both her mother and Caleb turned to look at her. No, nobody's stepping back from anybody. I spent my whole life letting other people decide what was safest for me, what I ought to want, what I ought to settle for. And I am done doing that, Mama. If Silas Bryant wants to punish this family for the crime of me choosing a man who's kind to me over one who isn't, then let him try and let the whole town watch him do it. Because I'd rather stand here in the wreckage of that than go back to being quiet and grateful and small. Ruth stared at her daughter for a long moment, and something in her face, the same something that had flickered at the supper table days before, moved further, this time closer to breaking open entirely. You sound like your grandmother, she said, finally quiet. She used to talk like that. Before she married a man half this town told her not to marry and made a good life out of it anyway. I never knew that. There's a great many things I haven't told you, Ruth said, on account of being afraid most of my life that wanting things loudly gets a woman hurt. I see now I might have been wrong to teach you the same fear. She looked at Caleb, assessing him now, rather than accusing. You truly mean to stand by her, whatever it costs? Yes, ma'am. Even if it costs you everything you've built here, especially then, Caleb said. A man who only stays kind when it's easy ain't much of a man at all in my accounting. Ruth didn't say anything else, but she didn't argue either, and when she left the forge a few minutes later, she paused at the door and looked back at the two of them, something almost like approval settling into the lines of her face before she disappeared up the street. The trouble came to a head on Sunday at the church social held on the green behind the chapel, where half the town had gathered under the shade of the old oaks for lemonade and gossip disguised as fellowship. Josie hadn't wanted to go. Her mother had insisted, arguing that hiding away would only feed the talk, and Josie had come to believe grudgingly that her mother was right. Colt Bryant was there, of course, holding court near the refreshment table, with a knot of admiring young men around him, and the moment Josie arrived on Caleb's arm, a small deliberate gesture, her hand tucked into his elbow, the way a woman's hand rests when she means for people to see it. Colt's easy laughter died in his throat. He crossed the green before she'd even reached the lemonade table. Didn't expect you'd have the nerve to show your face, he said loud enough to draw eyes, which Josie understood now was the entire point. It's a church social, Colt. I reckon I've got as much right to lemonade as anybody. Right to parade your blacksmith around like you didn't just cost half this town their livelihoods. His eyes swept over her, cold, deliberate, the same look he'd once given her that she'd mistaken years ago for interest, before she understood it had only ever been assessment. Tell me something, Josephine. Does it hurt yet? Watching him lose customers one by one cause of you, or are you too busy feeling special that a man finally noticed you to care what it's costing him? That's enough, Caleb said low. I wasn't talking to you. You're talking about her in front of me. That makes it my business. Caleb's voice hadn't risen, but something in his stance had shifted weight, settling forward onto the balls of his feet, and Josie felt the tension in his arm under her hand. Colt smiled thin and mean. Funny thing about you, Morgan. Whole town used to feel a little sorry for you. Quiet fella kept to himself, tragic story about his brother. If you dig deep enough, folks like that story. Makes 'em generous. But generosity runs out same as customers do. And once my father's done with you, there won't be a soul left in this county willing to trade with a man who thinks he's owed something just 'cause he's had it hard. Something in Caleb's face went very still, very quiet, the way the forge went quiet in the second before the hammer fell. You don't get to use my brother to make a point at a church social, Bryant. I'll use whatever I please. Caleb moved before Colt finished the sentence. Not a punch, but close enough to want a hand closing hard around the front of Colt's shirt, pulling him up onto his toes, the crowd around them gasping and scattering back in a widening circle. For one long, suspended second, it looked like the whole green was about to watch a fight break out in the middle of Sunday fellowship. "Caleb, don't," Josie said, grabbing his arm. "He's not worth it. He's not worth what it'll cost you if you hit him in front of this whole town." It was that, not the crowd, not Colt's sputtering, but Josie's hand tight on his arm, and her voice steady in his ear that brought Caleb back from wherever the anger had taken him. He released Colt's shirt, slow, deliberate, and stepped back, breathing hard. "She's right," Caleb said mostly to himself. "You ain't worth it." Colt straightened his collar face blotchy with fury and humiliation in equal measure, painfully aware of every eye on the green. "You'll regret that," he said low, meant only for Caleb and Josie to hear. "Both of you." He walked off through the parting crowd, and the social resumed its awkward whispering rhythm around them. But Reverend Hollis, a quiet, steady man, who rarely inserted himself into town squabbles, crossed the green a moment later and set a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Walk with me a minute, son," the Reverend said, and then to Josie with a small, kind nod. "Miss Calloway, you did right pulling him back. Took courage standing between two angry men on a Sunday. I imagine it ain't the first time you've had to be the steady one in a room." It wasn't, and something about a stranger, even a kind one, recognizing that plainly in front of everyone, loosened something tight in Josie's chest that had been wound tight for days. Nettie found her a few minutes later, pressing a cup of lemonade into her hand. "Well," Nettie said, watching Colt's retreating back, "I'd say that went about as well as it could have gone, all things considered, which is to say, not well at all, but at least nobody got their nose broken." "He mentioned Caleb's brother," Josie said quietly, "in front of everybody, like it was nothing, like it was just a weapon he could reach for." "Cruelty's most men's last resort when charm stops working," Nettie said. "Don't mean it doesn't cut." It cut. Josie carried the weight of it home, and it was still sitting heavy in her chest 3 days later when her father came home from the store with a letter in his hand, his face the color of old ash, and set it on the kitchen table without a word. Josie picked it up. The seal was already broken. The letterhead read Larkspur County Bank, and the words beneath it in careful, deliberate script informed Thomas Calloway that an irregularity had been discovered in the store's loan documentation requiring immediate review, and that until such review was complete, the bank was exercising its right to call the full balance due within 10 days. 10 days. "There's no irregularity," Thomas said, his voice flat with a kind of exhausted fury Josie had never heard from her father in her whole life. "I've paid every note on time for 6 years. I have the receipts to prove it. This is Silas Bryant deciding he wants his pound of flesh and dressing it up as banking business." Ruth sat down hard in a kitchen chair, her hand pressed to her mouth. "What happens?" Josie asked, though she already knew the shape of the answer even before her father said it. "If we can't pay it in 10 days. Thomas looked at his daughter, and for the first time in her life, she saw real fear in her father's eyes. Not for himself, but for the store he'd spent 30 years building the roof over all their heads, the only life any of them had ever known. "Then we lose everything," he said, "and I reckon Silas Bryant intends for every soul in this town to know exactly why." Josie didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, counting the 10 days like a woman counting down to an execution, turning the little iron horseshoe over and over in her hand until the metal had gone warm from her grip. And somewhere near midnight, she stopped counting and started thinking. Instead, really thinking the way her father had taught her to think, when a column of numbers refused to balance, not by staring harder at the wrong figures, but by asking what figure was missing. By morning, she had her boots on before the sun was fully up, and she walked the 2 streets to the forge, with a purpose in her stride that made 2 early-rising neighbors stop and stare. Caleb was already awake, banking the fire for the day, and he took one look at her face and set down the poker. "What happened?" she told him. "The letter, the 10 days, the irregularity that wasn't an irregularity at all." Caleb's expression didn't crumble the way she half expected. It sharpened instead the way a man's face sharpens when a problem finally shows him an edge he can get a grip on. A bank don't get to call a note without cause, Josie. Even Silas Bryant's bank. There's a state banking examiner out of Austin who reviews complaints like this, I know, because I looked into it myself quiet after he threatened my note the first time. Man can't just invent an irregularity. He's got to produce paper to back it, and paper can be checked.
Bon, c'était vraiment que.
You think he's lying. I think a man that confident about breaking somebody don't usually have the law standing square behind him. I think he's counting on your father being too proud or too scared or too tired to ask hard enough who's supposed to be watching men like him. Caleb reached for his coat, still speaking, already moving. I've got a friend rode dispatch out of Austin 2 summers back. Knows the examiner's office. Might take a week to get word there and back. Might take less if I ride part of it myself, instead of waiting on the mail. Caleb, that's 4 days out and 4 days back on a horse. You'd have to hire money you don't have. Then I'll walk if I have to, he said simply, like the arithmetic of it didn't concern him at all. Your father's carried an honest debt, honest for 6 years, Josie. I ain't about to stand by while a man like Silas Bryant dresses up greed as banking and calls it justice. Not for your family. Not after everything your father did for me the day he stood between me and Colt, without even knowing I was fixing to be somebody worth standing for. Josie felt something break loose in her chest. Something that had been held tight and careful since the letter landed on the kitchen table, and for a moment she couldn't speak at all. 10 days, she finally managed. Then we'd best not waste the first one standing here talking about it, Caleb said, and there was something steady and certain in his voice. Something that made the fear in her chest ease just slightly room enough to breathe. Go on and tell your father to gather every receipt, every paid note, every scrap of paper proving he's kept his end of that loan honest. I'll see about the rest. She caught his sleeve before he could turn for the door, and for one long suspended moment they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth still coming off him from the banked fire behind them, close enough that neither one of them was thinking about banks or notes or 10 days at all. Thank you, she said quiet. Don't thank me yet, Caleb said low, his eyes steady on hers. Thank me once we've won. He tipped his hat, the same small gesture he'd given her that first terrible afternoon on Main Street, and walked out into the gray early light toward the livery already moving like a man who had exactly 10 days and did not intend to waste a single hour of them. By the second day, Larkspur had already decided what it believed about Caleb Morgan's absence, and none of what it believed was true. Heard he lit out for good, said a man. Josie didn't recognize, leaning against the mercantile post while she swept the store's front step, not troubling to lower his voice for her benefit. Smart, if you ask me. Man sees a debt he can't cover. Best thing he can do is get gone before the sheriff comes asking. Nobody asked you, Josie said, not pausing her sweeping. Just saying what half the town's saying, miss. Then half the town's wrong same as you are. She set the broom against the wall harder than it needed setting. Mr. Morgan rode out on business. He'll be back. But she said it with more certainty than she felt, because 2 days had come and gone with no word, and the 10 days on her father's letter had become 8, then 7. And every morning she woke expecting to find some sign of him. A note, a rider, anything. And every morning there was nothing but the empty road out past the church where it bent toward the Austin Trail. Nettie found her sweeping a second time that same step well past when the step needed it. You're going to wear a hole clean through that wood. I don't know what else to do with my hands, Nettie. Well, you could stop giving Colt Bryant's friends the satisfaction of watching you fret in public for one. Nettie took the broom gently from her hands. He'll be back, Josie. Man like that doesn't say he'll do a thing and then not do it. I've known plenty of men who talk big and deliver small. Caleb Morgan ain't built that way. You don't know that. I know you wouldn't have fallen for a man who was, Nettie said, and something in the simple certainty of it eased the knot in Josie's chest, if only a little. Colt made sure the knot came back before the day was out. He found her at the well behind the store drawing water for the evening, and he didn't bother with pretense. This time, didn't bother pretending the visit was about anything but what it plainly was. 6 days left. he said, watching her crank the bucket up. Man doesn't ride to Austin and back in 6 days on a hired horse, Josephine. Reckon your father ought to start packing. Get off our property, Colt. It's a public well. He smiled thin. I'll say this for you, you've got more nerve than sense sticking by a fella who's likely halfway to the New Mexico territory by now with whatever coin he could scrape together. Some women learn. You never did. Josie set the bucket down, water sloshing over her hand, cold and grounding. You know what I think, Colt? I think you're standing here telling me all this because some part of you is scared he's not running. Scared he's going to come back with exactly what he went to fetch, and you and your father are going to have a great deal of explaining to do. Something flickered behind Colt's eyes. Not quite fear, but close kin to it. Gone almost as fast as it appeared, covered over with a laugh that came out too loud to be believed. You always did have a fanciful mind, Josephine. Comes from reading too many of those penny novels your father sells. He tipped an imaginary hat, mocking the gesture Caleb always gave her, plain and honest. 6 days. She watched him go. Her hands shaking now, not from fear exactly, but from the effort of not letting him see how deep his words had cut, and she carried the water back inside and set it down harder than she meant to, enough that Ruth looked up from the stove. What happened? Colt, same as always. Josie pressed the back of her wet hand to her forehead. Mama, what if he's right? What if something's happened to Caleb out there and we never— Don't, Ruth said sharp, surprising them both. Don't you dare finish that sentence in my kitchen. That man has done nothing these past weeks but prove himself steady as bedrock, and I'll not have you borrowing trouble from Colt Bryant's mouth of all the mouths in this town to trust. It was such an unexpected thing, hearing her mother defend Caleb with real heat in her voice, that Josie almost laughed despite everything, and for a moment the kitchen felt lighter than it had in days. The lightness didn't last past sundown. Ezra came to the store just as Thomas was closing up his face tight in a way that made Josie's stomach drop before he'd said a single word. Somebody's been circling the forge past 2 nights running, Ezra said, low, glancing back over his shoulder like he expected to be overheard. Thought it was strays at first, dogs getting into the scrap bin. Tonight I saw a fella slip through the back fence proper, deliberate-like, and he wasn't after scrap. Did you see who? Too dark, and he was gone quick when my dog started up. But Caleb keeps his ledgers there, Josie. Every paid receipt, every letter, everything proving what your father's owed and what he's already paid. If somebody's got a mind to make that paperwork disappear before the examiner ever sees it. Josie was already moving before he finished the sentence, grabbing her shawl off the hook by the door. Josephine Ann, it is near dark, Ruth called after her. Then I'd best hurry. She half ran the 2 streets to the forge with Ezra close behind, and the closer they got, the more her chest tightened. Some animal instinct in her rising up before her mind had caught up to name what it was responding to. A smell faint but unmistakable riding on the evening air. Smoke. Not the banked familiar smoke of a working forge gone quiet for the night, but something sharper, wronger, carrying an edge of panic with it that had nothing to do with iron. Ezra, I smell it too. He broke into a run, and Josie ran after him, her skirts bunched in her fists, and when they rounded the corner onto the street where the forge sat, the first thing Josie saw was a thin ribbon of orange light licking up along the base of the back wall, where the scrap pile and the wood store sat close together, close enough that whoever had set the flame there hadn't needed much to make it catch. Fire! Ezra bellowed loud enough to wake half the street. Fire! Josie didn't think. She ran straight for the door. Josie, don't. The ledgers are on the shelf by the workbench, Ezra. I know exactly where I've watched him reach for them a dozen times. She was already through the door, smoke thin but thickening by the second, curling along the rafters, the crackle of the growing fire at the back wall, loud enough now to drown out her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She found the shelf by feel more than sight, her eyes already stinging her lungs, already protesting, and she swept the ledgers and the loose papers into her apron, folding it up around them like a sack. And she was turning for the door again, when a support beam near the back gave way with a groan and a shower of sparks, and the fire which had been contained to the scrap pile a moment before leapt sideways along a line of dry kindling stacked for the forge and found the wall. The heat hit her like a hand shoving her backward. "Josie!" Ezra's voice from the doorway, sharp with terror. "Josie, get out now!" She turned disoriented for one terrible half-second by the smoke thickening fast around her, unable to see the door. Clearly, her lungs burning, and it was the sound of Ezra's voice, steady and urgent, that let her find the shape of the doorway again, and she stumbled toward it with the ledgers clutched to her chest and hands. Ezra's hands and others, now neighbors already running with buckets, pulled her the last few feet out into the cool evening air, and she went down hard on her knees in the dirt, coughing, her eyes streaming. Her palms scraped raw and starting to blister where an ember had caught the edge of her sleeve. "I'm all right," she managed between coughs. "I'm all right, I have them. I have the ledgers." Behind her, the forge was properly burning now, flames climbing the back wall, and half of Larkspur seemed to be converging on the street at once, buckets passing hand to hand from the well. Reverend Hollis, directing men to soak blankets and beat down the flames licking toward the roof, and in the chaos of it, in the flickering orange light and the shouting and the smoke, nobody noticed. Right away, the shape of a man slipping away down the alley behind the livery, moving fast, moving like a man who did not want to be seen leaving the scene of something he'd started. Nobody noticed except Josie, still on her knees in the dirt, who caught one clear glimpse of him under the light of the flames before he vanished around the corner. Tall, quick, a familiar set to his shoulders that made her blood go cold even through the haze of smoke and fear. "Colt," she whispered. Nobody heard her. The fire was roaring too loud, and the bucket line was too urgent, and it wasn't until the flames had finally been beaten back. An hour later, the forge scorched and smoking, but standing the worst of it contained to the back wall and the wood store that anyone had breath enough to ask questions. That was when a horse came pounding up the street at a dead run, lathered and blowing hard, and Caleb Morgan swung down off it before it had even fully stopped his face, white with a fear Josie had never once seen on him. Not even the day Silas Bryant had stood in his doorway, threatening everything he owned. Josie. He crossed the ruined yard in 3 strides and had his hands on her shoulders, her face checking her over with a kind of desperate thoroughness that made her throat close up. "You're hurt. Your hand. It's a burn. Caleb, it's small. I'm all right. You went inside a burning building." His voice cracked on the word building, cracked in a way she'd never heard from him, not even talking about Daniel. "You went inside Josie. Why in God's name would you?" "Because your whole case was in there," she said, holding up the scorched, smoke-stained bundle still clutched against her apron. "Every receipt, every paid note, everything proving my father never defaulted on anything. Everything that would have burned to nothing if I hadn't." Caleb pulled her against his chest before she could finish, so hard and so suddenly that the breath went out of her, and he held on like a man who had ridden 4 days, believing he might be riding back to nothing. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Just stood there in the smoking wreckage of his life's work, with her heart hammering against his and his hand shaking where it cradled the back of her head. "Don't you ever do that again," he said, muffled into her hair. "Don't you ever risk yourself for a stack of paper, whatever it proves." It wasn't just paper, Caleb. It was your whole future, your name, everything Silas Bryant's trying to take from you. "I don't care about my name if it costs me you." He pulled back enough to look at her, his hands still braced on her shoulders like he needed the contact to believe she was really there. "I mean that plain, Josie. I'd rather lose the shop, lose the whole town's business, lose every last nail I ever forged, than lose you to a fire some coward set in the dark." "I saw him," Josie said, and Caleb went very still. "The man who said it. I only got a glimpse, but it was Colt Caleb. I'd know his shape anywhere by now. I watched him run off down the alley behind the livery, not 5 minutes before you rode up." Ezra, standing close enough to hear, went hard-faced. "I'll fetch the sheriff." "Wait." Caleb's voice was tight-controlled, a man reining in something dangerous. A glimpse in firelight and smoke ain't proof enough to hang an accusation on, not against a name like Bryant. Sheriff Doyle's a fair man, but he'll want more than what Josie half saw in a panic. And Colt's father will have 3 witnesses ready inside the hour, swearing his boy was home in bed the whole night. Then what do we do? Josie's voice shook more from fury now than fear. Just let him get away with it. He's already trying to steal my family's store out from under us, with a lie about paperwork. And now he's tried to burn down your whole life to cover his tracks. And you want to wait for proof. I want to win, Caleb said, and something in the flat certainty of it made her go quiet. Not just this fight tonight. All of it. And winning means doing this right with paper and proof this county can't argue with, not with accusations that'll give Silas Bryant a chance to paint us as desperate and dishonest instead of him. He reached into his coat and, his hand still slightly unsteady from the ride, drew out a folded, travel-worn envelope, the seal marked with the stamp of the state banking examiner's office out of Austin. Which is why I rode 4 days instead of resting even one Josie. I've got exactly what we need. The crowd that had gathered to fight the fire hadn't fully dispersed, drawn now by the sight of Caleb Morgan holding up an official-looking envelope in the smoking wreckage of his own forge, and Reverend Hollis, ever the steady hand in a chaotic moment, raised his voice to settle the murmuring. Let the man speak. Caleb broke the seal with hands that still trembled, but his voice, when he read from the letter inside, was steady as iron. To whom it may concern, this office has reviewed the complaint filed by Larkspur County Bank regarding an alleged irregularity in the loan account of Thomas Calloway, account number 4471. Having examined the original loan documentation on file with this office dated and filed at the time of origination, this office finds no discrepancy between the terms recorded here and the payment history submitted for review. Furthermore, this office finds that no formal complaint or irregularity report was filed with this examiner's office prior to the letter sent to Mr. Calloway, a violation of standard banking procedure requiring examiner notification before any accelerated call on a performing note. Caleb looked up, and his eyes found Josie's, then swept the gathered crowd. In plain words, neighbors, there was no irregularity. There never was. Silas Bryant made it up, wrote a letter dressed up as banking law, and hoped nobody in this town would think to ask the one office in the state whose whole job is checking men like him. A murmur ran through the crowd, disbelief curdling fast into something angrier. That's a serious accusation, son, came a voice from the back. Old Jed Ainsley, the rancher, who'd taken his business to Millbrook, pushing forward now with a look on his face like a man reconsidering every choice he'd made in the past 2 weeks. You certain that letter says what you say it says? Read it yourself, Jed. I'll stand right here while you do. Caleb held it out, and Jed took it, and read it slow, his lips moving faintly over the words. And when he looked up, his face had gone hard, in a way Josie had never seen on the mild old rancher. I took my business to Millbrook, Jed said, mostly to himself, mostly in disgust. Told myself I had no choice with my mortgage held where it's held. Man threatened my land over a rumor, and it wasn't even a true rumor to begin with. He handed the letter back, jaw set. I owe you an apology, Caleb Morgan, and I reckon Silas Bryant owes this whole town a great deal more than that. There's more, Josie said, stepping forward before she'd fully decided to the scorched ledgers still clutched in her arms. I saw who set this fire tonight. It was Colt Bryant. I know a glimpse in the dark isn't proof enough for a sheriff on its own. Caleb's right about that. But somebody in this crowd must have seen something too. A horse tied somewhere it shouldn't have been. A man walking where he had no cause to walk this late. Silas Bryant's letter proves the family's willing to lie with paper. I don't reckon it's such a stretch to believe his son's willing to lie with fire. Oh, sweet human bud. For a long moment, nobody spoke the crackle of the last dying embers. The only sound in the street. And then a voice came from near the back of the crowd, hesitant, unfamiliar to Josie, belonging to a young man she recognized vaguely as one of the bank's junior clerks. I saw him, the clerk said, and every head turned. Colt Bryant. I was walking home past the livery not an hour before the fire started, and he was there arguing with somebody, didn't hear who. but I heard him say the word ledgers plain as day, and something about making sure a certain fella didn't have anything left to prove anything with. Didn't think much of it at the time. Man's always running his mouth about something." The clerk's face had gone pale, clearly unused to being the center of so many eyes. "Wouldn't have thought twice about it if I hadn't just heard Mr. Morgan read that letter." Ezra was already moving. "That's enough for Sheriff Doyle to ask questions at the very least. I'll fetch him now." Wait. This time, it was Thomas Calloway's voice arriving late to the scene with Ruth close behind him, both of them having run, the moment word of the fire reached the store. Thomas took in the smoking ruin of the forge, his daughter's scorched hand. The crowd gathered thick around Caleb and his letter, and something settled into his face. Not shock, but resolve. The look of a man who had spent 30 years being patient and had finally run clean out of patience to spend. "Fetch the sheriff, Ezra. But fetch him to the bank, not the forge. I want Silas Bryant standing in front of this whole town when the truth of what he's done gets laid out plain, same as he stood in front of this whole town making his threats. Man ought to answer for cowardice in the same daylight he dealt it." Twa. The crowd, still smoldering with its own kind of anger, now began to move as one loose body toward Main Street, toward the bank's dark windows. And Josie found herself walking in the middle of it, with Caleb's hand closed tight around her uninjured one. The scorched ledgers still hugged to her chest like something precious. And for the first time in 10 long, fearful days, she felt something other than dread rising up in her chest. Something that felt unmistakably like the beginning of a reckoning too long overdue. Sheriff Garrett Doyle met them at the corner of Main Street, roused from his supper, his badge still being pinned on crooked, as he hurried to catch up with the size of the crowd moving toward the bank. He took one look at the scorched ledgers, the burn on Josie's hand. The examiner's letter Caleb pressed into his palm, and his easy, unhurried manner sharpened into something a great deal more serious. "Arson and fraud, if what you're telling me holds up," Doyle said, reading fast in the lamplight held up by a half-dozen hands around him. "That's not town gossip anymore, Morgan. That's a hanging matter for the fraud, and a long stretch in Huntsville for the fire if it's proven." "It'll prove," Caleb said. "The clerk saw Colt at the livery not an hour before it started. I've got the examiner's letter in black and white saying Silas never filed what he claimed to file, and Josie saw him running from the fire itself." Doyle nodded, slow, tucking the letter carefully inside his coat. "Then I reckon Silas Bryant's about to have a very long night." He looked around at the crowd swelling now, with more curious neighbors, drawn by the commotion lanterns, bobbing up and down the street, like fireflies, gathering for a single purpose. "Best you all stay back a respectful distance when we knock on that door. I'll do the asking. But I won't say I mind an audience for it, given everything this family's put this town through." The bank's windows were dark when they reached it. The door locked fast, and Doyle's fist against the wood rang out loud in the hushed waiting street, the whole crowd behind him holding its breath as one. It took a long moment before a light appeared behind the curtained glass, and longer still before the bolt scraped back and the door opened to reveal Silas Bryant in his shirt sleeves, hair mussed from sleep, his face going through a rapid, unconvincing performance of confusion at the sight of the sheriff and half the town crowded on his doorstep at this hour. "Sheriff, neighbors, to what do I owe—" "Evening, Silas!" Doyle's voice was mild, almost friendly, which somehow made it more menacing than shouting would have. "Got some questions for you about a certain letter you sent Thomas Calloway, and about where your boy Colt spent his evening. Reckon you'd best invite us in or step out here and answer plain either way. Suits me fine, but I don't figure you want the whole street hearing every word twice over." Silas's eyes swept the crowd, found Caleb's face, found the scorched ledgers still cradled in Josie's arms, found the examiner's letter visible now in the sheriff's hand, and something in his composed banker's face began for the first time since any of them had known him to crack. "I don't know what lies you've been fed, Sheriff, but I assure you, wasn't fed anything, Silas. Read it myself." Doyle held the letter up close enough for Silas to see the state seal stamped at the top, without letting it leave his own hand. State examiner says there weren't no irregularity filed on the Calloway account before your letter went out. Says calling a note early without notifying his office first is a violation plain as day of banking procedure. You know better than most men in this county. That's fraud, Silas. Not gossip. Fraud, with a state seal on the paper proving it. A clerical oversight. A clerical oversight don't dress itself up in threatening language and land on a man's kitchen table with 10 days on the clock, Thomas Calloway said, stepping forward from the crowd, his voice low and hard, in a way Josie had rarely heard from her mild, careful father. You sat across a desk from me, Silas Bryant, and told me my daughter's choices had consequences. I reckon it's time you learned yours do too. Silas's jaw worked, his eyes darting once more across the crowd, searching. Josie realized for his son, for some ally to back him, and finding none. This is a misunderstanding that can be settled privately, gentlemen. If we'd all just, ain't nothing private about a letter sent to threaten a man's livelihood in front of witnesses, Doyle said. And it surely ain't private no more, given how many folks are standing on your step right now having heard every word of this. He glanced past Silas into the dark hall of the house behind him. Where's your boy, Silas? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Silas's composure, already fracturing, seemed to give way entirely. I don't know what you mean. I mean, a man matching Colt's build was seen at the livery not an hour before Caleb Morgan's forge went up in flames tonight, arguing about ledgers, and another witness saw him running from the fire itself. I mean, I aim to ask your son some questions, and I'd rather ask them now civil than have to come looking for him later, which tends to go worse for everybody involved. He's not here, Silas said too quickly, and the lie sat plain and ugly in the lamplight for everyone to see. It was Nettie Voss of all people who called it. She'd pushed her way near the front of the crowd sometime in the last few minutes, arms crossed, chin lifted. His horse is tied round back of the livery this very minute, Silas Bryant. I passed it not 20 minutes ago, walking over here lathered up something fierce, like it had been ridden hard and put away wet by somebody in an almighty hurry to get home unseen. Doyle didn't wait for Silas's permission. He stepped past him into the house, two of the townsmen falling in behind him without being asked, and the crowd on the street held its breath, murmuring low until a shout came from somewhere inside Doyle's voice, sharp, and a scuffle of footsteps, and a moment later, Colt Bryant was half-marched, half-dragged out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves, his face a mess of fury and fear in equal measure, a smear of soot still dark along one forearm that he hadn't had time to scrub away. Get your hands off me, Colt snarled, wrenching against Doyle's grip. Where were you tonight, son? Doyle's voice had gone flat. Official, none of the earlier mildness left in it. Home. Asleep. Then how do you explain the soot on your arm, or the fact half this town just watched Caleb Morgan's forge burn, not an hour past, or a witness who heard you arguing about ledgers at the livery right before it happened? Colt's eyes found Josie's across the crowd, and for one long moment, something raw and ugly and afraid passed over his face before he mastered it back into something like defiance. I don't have to answer to a mob. You'll answer to a judge then, which is a good deal less forgiving than a mob tends to be, Doyle said. Colt Bryant, I'm arresting you on suspicion of arson, and your father alongside you on suspicion of bank fraud, and you can both sort out your innocence in a courtroom in front of a judge who won't much care whose name is painted on the biggest building in town. You can't... Silas started, but whatever protest he meant to raise died in his throat when he looked out at the crowd gathered on his own street at faces he'd known for years. Jed Ainsley, Reverend Hollis neighbors he'd loaned money to and threatened in equal measure over the years, and found not one of them looking back at him with anything but cold, unmoved judgment. Should have thought of what I could and couldn't do, Doyle said, before you sent a fraudulent letter and raised a son willing to set fire to cover for it. They led Colt down the steps. First, still protesting, still twisting against the grip on his arms, and as he passed close by where Josie and Caleb stood at the edge of the crowd, he stopped struggling just long enough to look at her. Something bitter and broken in his expression that she almost felt sorry for, before she remembered the smoke still stinging her eyes and the burn throbbing on her palm. Hope he's worth it, Colt said, low, venomous nodding at Caleb. Hope the blacksmith's worth losing everything I could have given you." "He already gave me more than you ever did," Josie said, steady, unflinching. "He gave me the truth. That's worth more than every cattle contract your family ever held, Colt, and I reckon it always will be." Doyle pulled him along before he could answer, and Silas followed a moment later, stripped of his coat's fine composure, now his face gray and old in the lamplight, muttering protests that nobody in the crowd troubled themselves to listen to anymore. The street didn't empty out even after the sheriff and his prisoners had gone. Neighbors lingered, some coming to press Caleb's hand or Thomas's shoulder, murmuring apologies for doubted loyalty for business taken elsewhere out of fear for silence kept, when a word of support might have mattered. Jed Ainsley promised loud enough for half the street to hear that his plow blades would be back at Caleb's forge the moment it was rebuilt, and no amount of Bryant money would ever move his business again. Josie barely heard any of it. She stood in the middle of the thinning crowd, with her burned hand wrapped now in a strip of someone's torn petticoat, the scorched ledgers finally set down safe in her father's keeping, and Caleb's arm still fixed tight around her shoulders, like he had no intention of letting go of her again that night, or perhaps ever. "It's over," she said, quiet, disbelieving, watching the lantern light of the departing sheriff's party bob away down the dark street. "It's actually over. Not all of it," Caleb said, and something in his voice made her look up at him. His face, streaked with soot and exhaustion, held an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded. Something that looked in the flickering last light of the dying fire behind them. Very much like a man standing at the edge of a decision he'd already made, and was only waiting for the right moment to speak aloud. But he didn't speak it yet. He only tightened his arm around her, and together they turned to walk home through a town that for the first time since the day of the proposal was finally entirely on their side. Caleb walked her all the way to her father's door that night, and whatever he'd been on the verge of saying back at the smoking ruin of the forge, he kept it tucked behind his teeth, choosing instead to press a careful kiss to the back of her bandaged hand and tell her to rest. "Tomorrow," he said. "I've got something to say to you, Josie, and I mean to say it right, not standing in ash with half the county listening in." "You could say it now." "Could," he agreed. "Won't. You've had enough excitement for one night, and so have I, and I'd rather you hear what I've got to tell you when we're both steady enough to remember it clear." He touched the brim of his hat, the gesture so familiar to her now it felt like a small ceremony between them. "Sleep well, Josie." She didn't sleep well. She lay awake turning his words over, same as she'd turned the little iron horseshoe over so many nights running, wondering what a man said after a night like that one, when he'd already said so much without saying it plain. But morning came, and with it came word that pushed the question clean out of her mind for the better part of a week. Judge Aldous Pruitt rode into Larkspur on the strength of a rider Sheriff Doyle had sent to the county seat that same night, and by Wednesday the whole town knew a circuit trial would be held in the church hall, on account of it being the only room in Larkspur large enough to hold everyone who intended to attend, which appeared to be nearly the entire county. Never seen this town so stirred up over anything that wasn't a cattle drive or a wedding, Nettie said, helping Josie set out chairs the morning of the trial. The church hall already half full an hour before the judge was even due to arrive. "Reckon this qualifies as both in its own way." Josie's stomach hadn't settled since Sunday. "What if it goes wrong, Nettie? What if Silas has a lawyer clever enough to twist all of it around? Then you'll still have told the truth, and told it loud, and that counts for something regardless of what any judge decides." Nettie squeezed her shoulder. "But for what it's worth, I don't reckon it'll go wrong. I've seen Silas Bryant bluster his way out of plenty over the years. I've never seen him bluster his way out of a state seal." Silas arrived with a lawyer from Fort Worth, a slick, unhurried man named Prescott, who wore his suit like armor and spoke like every sentence had been rehearsed twice before breakfast. Colt arrived separately under guard, his wrists bound, his face gone gaunt in the days since his arrest, none of his old swagger left in him. Josie watched him take his seat and felt, despite everything, a strange hollow pang that surprised her. Not forgiveness, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The kind of pity a person feels for a thing that broke itself trying to break someone else. The trial did not go the way Prescott had clearly hoped. He tried first to argue the examiner's letter was ambiguous, that irregularity could mean any number of things, that his client had acted in good faith on information since proven mistaken. Judge Pruitt, a weathered no-nonsense man who'd clearly sat through 100 variations of the same performance, cut him off without much patience. "Counselor, I've read the letter myself. It says plain as morning that no complaint was filed with the examiner's office before Mr. Bryant sent his own letter demanding payment in 10 days. That ain't ambiguous. That's a man inventing a crisis to squeeze two families he had a personal grudge against. Move along to your next argument if you've got one." Prescott tried a different tack after that, suggesting the fire and the fraud were unconnected matters, that his client bore no responsibility for whatever his adult son might have done independently. "And as for the witness testimony placing my client's son at the scene," Prescott went on, turning smoothly toward Josie, where she sat between her parents, "I'd remind the court that Miss Calloway's account comes from a young woman who, by her own admission, was standing in smoke and near darkness, distraught, having just risked her own safety in a burning building. Hardly the steadiest of witnesses. One might wonder, too, whether a woman so recently and publicly humiliated by my client's son might carry some understandable if unfortunate motive to see him blamed for something he had no part in." A ripple of offended murmuring moved through the hall, but Josie was already on her feet before her father could put a steadying hand on her arm. "Your Honor, may I speak plain?" Judge Pruitt studied her a moment, then nodded. "Go ahead, Miss Calloway." "Mr. Prescott's right that I was humiliated by Colt Bryant," Josie said, her voice steady, despite the pounding in her chest. "Humiliated in front of half this county, in fact, which every soul in this hall watched happen with their own eyes, so there's no need to take my word for that part. But being humiliated by a man doesn't make me a liar about what I saw 2 weeks later with my own eyes in the light of a fire he set. I know Colt Bryant's shape, his walk, the way he carries his shoulders when he's running from something he's ashamed of on account of... I spent near a year of my girlhood watching him from a distance and hoping he'd notice me kindly before I learned better. I'm not confused about what I saw that night, and I'll not sit quiet while a lawyer from Fort Worth suggests my testimony's worth less because a man once wounded my pride. My pride's got nothing to do with what my eyes saw plain in that firelight." The hall went silent, and even Judge Pruitt allowed the ghost of something like approval to cross his weathered face before he cleared his throat and gestured for her to sit. "Duly noted, Miss Calloway. Counselor, unless you've got evidence contradicting the witness's account beyond speculation about her feelings, I'd suggest you move along." Prescott, visibly recalculating, shuffled his papers and did not raise the matter again. He tried once more, weaker now, to separate his client from his son's actions entirely, and it was Colt himself, unexpectedly, who broke that argument apart for good. "He knew," Colt said, standing without being asked, his guard reaching for his arm, before the judge waved the man back with a tired gesture. "Mr. Bryant, you'll have your turn to speak. Sit down." "No." Colt's voice cracked raw nothing left in it of the confident young man who'd knelt in the dirt on Main Street weeks before. "I've sat quiet my whole life doing what my father told me was necessary, and I'm done doing it, same as apparently everybody else in this county's decided to be done with him too. He told me to make sure Morgan's ledgers didn't survive the week. Said it plain over supper, like he was asking me to fetch a shovel. I did it because I was angry and stupid, and I wanted..." His voice broke entirely for a moment, and the whole hall went dead silent, waiting for him to find it again. "I wanted her to see what she'd thrown away. I wanted Morgan to lose everything so maybe she'd remember what it felt like to have somebody with something to offer. That's the truth of it, plain and ugly, and I'll answer for that myself. But I won't hang alone for a fire my father as good as lit with his own hand, just because his name's harder to touch than mine." The hall erupted into murmurs so loud, Judge Pruitt had to bang his gavel twice to settle it. And Silas, 3 seats away, had gone the color of old paper, his composed banker's mask finally completely gone. "That's a lie," Silas said, half rising. "My own son turning on me to save his own skin." "Sit down, Mr. Bryant, or I'll have you removed," Pruitt said, and something in his flat tone left no room for argument. Silas sat. It took the better part of the afternoon to work through the rest of it. The examiner's letter entered as evidence the clerk called to testify again under oath. Ezra and Josie, both giving their accounts of the fire. Thomas laying out 6 years of paid receipts on the table in front of the judge, with the quiet, devastating patience of a man who had waited a long time to be believed. But by the time the light through the church hall's windows had gone long and gold with late afternoon, Judge Pruitt had heard enough. Silas Bryant, this court finds you guilty of banking fraud in the matter of a falsified irregularity claim used to threaten the accelerated seizure of the Calloway family store, and further guilty of conspiracy in the destruction of Caleb Morgan's property by fire. You'll surrender your banking license effective today, pay restitution to both families in full plus damages, and you'll serve 2 years in the state penitentiary, which I consider a mercy given what you attempted against neighbors who trusted you with their livelihoods. Pruitt's gaze moved to Colt. Colt Bryant, this court finds you guilty of arson. Given your testimony here today, which this court considers a genuine if belated act of honesty, I'm inclined toward the lighter end of what the law allows. 1 year in restitution owed alongside your father's, and I'd suggest you spend that year thinking hard on the difference between wanting somebody and owning them, because from where I sit, son, you never once managed to tell the two apart. The gavel came down, and the hall broke into noise. Some of it triumphant, some of it merely stunned, and Josie sat between her parents with her bandaged hand pressed to her mouth, feeling something enormous finally let go inside her chest. It didn't feel like victory exactly. It felt like breathing after a long time spent forgetting how. The weeks that followed moved faster than Josie would have believed possible after the slow, dreadful crawl of the 10 days that came before them. The bank's board, scrambling to distance itself from Silas's disgrace, appointed a new manager from Millbrook. Within a fortnight, a quiet, careful woman named Constance Reyes, who called on the Calloways personally to confirm in writing that the store's note stood exactly where it always had paid current and never once in genuine default. Restitution money, when it came, covered not only the damage to Caleb's forge, but enough besides that Jed Ainsley and half a dozen other families quietly found their own old debts to the Bryant Bank forgiven outright, the new management apparently eager to prove itself nothing like what came before. Rebuilding the forge became unexpectedly something like a town celebration. Jed Ainsley showed up the first morning with lumber he refused to be paid for. Ezra brought 2 of his best hands from the livery. Reverend Hollis organized a rotation of volunteers so ambitious that Caleb barely had to lift a hammer himself for the first 3 days, though he tried anyway, restless in the way of a man unused to accepting help. Women from the church brought food enough to feed twice the number of workers, and somewhere in the second week, Josie noticed Prudence Sutter herself standing at the edge of the gathering with a basket of bread, looking distinctly uncomfortable, but present all the same. "I owe you an apology," Prudence said when Josie finally crossed to her more out of curiosity than warmth. "I said cruel things about you about Mr. Morgan. I told myself I was only speaking plain truths other folks were too polite to say. I see now I was only speaking my own smallness and calling it manners." She held out the bread like an offering that cost her something to give. "I don't expect you to forgive it quick. I only wanted you to know I've thought on it." Josie took the bread, considered a moment, then said simply, "Thank you, Prudence. That took more nerve than most apologies I've heard." It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, not yet, but it was a door left open rather than shut, and that felt to Josie like enough for now. A smaller moment struck her harder than Prudence's apology ever could. Late one afternoon, sorting nails at the mercantile counter, Josie noticed a girl of perhaps 13 lingering near the window, watching her with a kind of careful, searching attention that made Josie set down her work and smile. "Can I help you find something?" The girl flushed and looked at her shoes. "I heard what you said, at the trial, about not being confused about your eyes seeing plain even after being humiliated." She twisted her hands together, working up the nerve to keep going. "The boys at school call me names on account of my size, same as folks used to call you. I didn't think a body could stand up the way you did, and still get a happy ending out of it. Thought maybe standing up just got you more trouble. Josie came around the counter and crouched down to the girl's height, an old ache in her own chest recognizing itself plainly in the girl's face. It got me plenty of trouble along the way, I won't lie to you about that. But trouble ain't the same as ruin, and standing up straight through it is the only thing that ever got me anywhere worth being. You're not required to shrink yourself down to fit what small-minded folks think you ought to look like. You hear me? The girl nodded, something loosening in her shoulders that hadn't been there a moment before, and when she left the store a few minutes later, she walked a little taller than she had walking in, and Josie stood watching her go, with tears pricking unexpected at the corners of her eyes. Her mother's transformation ran deeper still. Ruth took to visiting the forge most afternoons that week, ostensibly to bring food. Though Josie noticed, she stayed longer, each time watching Caleb work, with an expression that had softened considerably from the woman who'd once called him a man with no name worth mentioning. I misjudged him. Ruth admitted one evening, the two of them shelling peas on the porch while the last of the light went purple over the rooftops. I misjudged a great many things, Josephine. I spent so many years afraid of what this town would say about us, about you, especially, that I forgot to ask whether the town's opinion was worth the fear I was handing you along with it. You were trying to protect me, Mama. I was trying to protect myself from having to watch you suffer the same things I suffered growing up plain in a town that valued pretty above kind. Ruth's hands went still over the pea pods. But protecting you that way only taught you the same lesson I learned, which was to make yourself small and grateful before anyone else could make you feel that way first. I'm sorry for that. I don't know that I've said it plain before, and I ought to have. Josie set down her own work and reached for her mother's hand, the gesture unfamiliar between them in its openness, but welcome all the same. You're saying it now. Better late than never, I suppose, Ruth said, and for the first time in longer than Josie could remember, her mother's laugh came out unguarded and real. But even with the town healing around her, even with the forge rising fresh and sturdy from its own ashes, even with her mother's hand warm in hers on quiet evenings, a small stubborn doubt kept surfacing in Josie's mind. One she hadn't managed to burn away, along with everything else. It sharpened into something close to real fear when Nettie mentioned offhand over a shared pot of coffee that a cattleman up from San Antonio had stopped through Larkspur that week and spent a long while at the forge, admiring Caleb's work, going so far as to offer him a position running the smithing operation for an entire ranching outfit 3 times the size of anything Larkspur could offer. Steady wages, a proper house, a fresh start somewhere. His name carried no old grief attached to it. He didn't say yes, did he? Josie asked, setting down her cup too hard. Didn't say no either, far as I heard, Nettie said, watching her carefully. Man be a fool not to at least consider it, Josie, given everything this town put him through before it finally came around. The doubt that had been circling low in Josie's chest for days rose up sharp and cold. She told herself it was foolish, told herself Caleb had never once given her reason to doubt him, and still she found herself walking to the forge that evening, with her heart in her throat, rehearsing a question she wasn't at all certain she wanted answered. She found him exactly where she always found him, and she asked it plain because plain was the only way she knew how to ask anything anymore. Nettie says a rancher from San Antonio offered you work. Better work. Someplace this town's cruelty never touched you. Caleb set down his tools unhurried and looked at her with an expression that held no surprise at all, only a kind of patient certainty. He did. Fair offer, too. Steady money, a real house, no bank breathing down my neck. Are you going to take it? Already told him no 3 days back. Caleb crossed to her, wiping his hands on his apron. Didn't think it worth mentioning on account of there was never really a decision to make. Man doesn't rebuild a life from ash in a town just to walk away from it the moment somebody offers him something shinier down the road. Everything I want is standing right here in Larkspur, Josie, ash and all. He tipped his head, studying her face, reading the fear still lingering there, plain as a brand. Is that what's had you looking so troubled all evening? I suppose it was foolish of me. Wasn't foolish. Only human. He reached for her hand, careful of the bandage still wrapped there. But I reckon it's time I answered a question you haven't quite asked yet before some other rumor comes along and puts fear in you again." Josie felt her breath catch, and it was on that same warm evening near the end of the month, the forge nearly finished, that the two of them sat down on an overturned crate outside it, the way he and Ezra had sat that very first night weeks before. And she finally said out loud what had been circling in her mind since the trial ended. "Can I ask you something, and will you promise to answer honest, even if it's not what I want to hear?" Caleb turned to look at her, fully setting aside the length of iron he'd been idly turning in his hands. "Always." "Would any of this have happened between us if the town hadn't turned so cruel that day? If Colt had never proposed? If Silas had never come after your note? If none of it had ever forced us together the way it did? Would you have ever said a single word to me, Caleb? Or would I still just be the girl who brings you your father's errands?" Something crossed Caleb's face. Not offense, but a kind of careful seriousness, like he understood the weight of the question and meant to give it its due, rather than a quick, comforting answer. "I told you once I'd watched you 3 years before I ever said a word," he said slowly. "That was true. I watched you carry sacks too heavy for you sooner than trouble a customer. Watched you sit with grieving widows nobody else remembered to sit with. Watched you keep your chin up through more unkindness than most folks face in a lifetime, and never once turn that unkindness back out onto anybody else, not even the ones who earned it." He reached over, took her uninjured hand in both of his, turning it over like he was studying something precious. "The proposal, the fire, the trial. None of that made me love you, Josie. It only gave me a reason I couldn't talk myself out of using to finally say so. Man can watch a fire burn a long while telling himself he'll warm his hands tomorrow. Sometimes it takes a bit of danger to make him step close enough to actually feel the heat." "That's not really an answer to what I asked." "It is if you're listening, right?" Caleb's thumb traced slow, careful circles over her knuckles. "I'd have loved you regardless, Josie. Might have taken me longer to find the nerve to say it without a whole town's crisis pushing me toward it on account of I've never been a man quick to trust my own wanting. But it would have come. I believe that plain and true. What happened these past weeks didn't make me choose you. It just made me stop being a coward about a choice I'd already made a long while back, without ever saying so out loud." Josie felt her eyes go hot and blinked hard against it, the same as she had that first morning in his shop weeks ago. "I needed to hear that. I think some part of me has spent this whole time waiting for somebody to tell me I was only chosen because of what the moment demanded, same as Colt once made his choosing feel like an obligation instead of a want." "I ain't Colt," Caleb said low, certain. "And you ain't a moment, Josie. You're the whole reason I've got anything left worth building, forge or otherwise." He reached into his coat, then unhurried, and drew out something small, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, setting it into her open palm with hands that for once weren't entirely steady. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a ring, not gold, not silver, but iron, forged, simple and true, with the same small flower worked delicately into its band that he'd once shaped into her horseshoe. The mark she understood now of every truly precious thing he made with his own 2 hands. "I don't have much to offer you, Josie, not the way Colt Bryant once could not land or cattle contracts or a name that opens doors in this town. I've got a forge that just finished burning down and getting built back up, and 2 good hands and a heart that's been yours a long while longer than I ever had the courage to admit." His voice had gone rough, unguarded, in a way she'd only heard from him once before, the night he told her about Daniel. "But I love you plain and whole, exactly as you are, not despite anything, not in spite of anything the town or your mama or Colt Bryant ever said about you being too much or not enough. You are, to my mind, exactly enough, and I'd be honored past telling if you'd let me spend the rest of my life proving I mean that every single day." Josie looked at the ring, then at him, her heart so full it ached with the fullness of it. "Ask me properly, Caleb Morgan. Not in front of a whole town this time. Just for me." Caleb slid off the crate onto one knee in the dirt outside his own rebuilt forge, The very same posture Colt had once used to humiliate her on Main Street, transformed now into something entirely different in his hands. Not a performance for an audience, but a private trembling truth meant only for her. "Josephine Calloway, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, before he'd even finished drawing breath after the question, and the word came out laughing and crying all at once. "Yes, Caleb, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it had been shaped for her hand alone, which she supposed it had. And when he rose and pulled her into his arms, she felt for the first time in her whole life entirely and completely chosen, not out of pity, not out of obligation, not out of the strange mathematics of a town's crisis, but simply plainly because a good man had looked at her, all of her, and decided she was the finest thing he'd ever found. Somewhere down the street, faint on the evening air, she could hear the ordinary sounds of Larkspur settling into night, a dog barking, a door closing, someone's laughter drifting from an open window, and none of it for once held a single word of judgment in it at all. "Well," Caleb said finally, against her hair, his voice thick with something that sounded remarkably like joy. "Reckon we'd better go tell your mother before Nettie beats us to it and tells the whole town first." Josie laughed, wet and unrestrained, her ringed hand still clutched tight in his. "Reckon we'd better." Neither of them moved right away. They stood there instead in the dark outside the rebuilt forge in no hurry at all, finally blessedly exactly where they'd both always belonged. Ruth heard the news before they'd even finished crossing the yard toward the house, because Nettie, true to every prediction either of them had made, had spotted the ring catching lamplight from clear across the street, and hadn't waited for an invitation to come running. "She's getting married," Nettie hollered, loud enough that half the neighboring porches lit their lamps to see what the commotion was. And by the time Josie and Caleb reached the door, Ruth was already standing on the step with her hand pressed to her chest, and tears standing plain in her eyes, and Thomas right behind her, already reaching for his daughter before she'd said a single word. "Let me see it," Ruth said, taking Josie's hand in both of hers, turning the iron ring toward the light with a reverence she'd never once shown Colt Bryant's gold one. "Oh, Josephine. Oh, it's perfect. It's exactly right for you. You don't think it's plain, just iron, no stone? I think it's the truest thing anybody's ever put on your finger," Ruth said, fierce, and pulled her daughter into an embrace so sudden and complete that Josie felt the whole weight of years of careful distance between them finally fully dissolve. "I'm proud of you. I should have said that plain a long while ago, about a great many things, but I'm saying it now, and I mean it with my whole heart." Thomas shook Caleb's hand with the solid, wordless approval of a man who'd been waiting for this exact moment since the day he'd stood between his daughter and Colt Bryant in the middle of Main Street. "Took you long enough, son." "Wasn't sure I had the right to ask some days," Caleb admitted. "You had the right the day you tipped your hat to her in front of the whole town and didn't care what it cost you," Thomas said. "Rest was just you catching up to what everybody else already knew." The wedding, once the date was set, became the second great gathering Larkspur had gathered around Josie and Caleb in as many months, though this one carried none of the smoke and fear of the first. Reverend Hollis offered the church without being asked. Nettie appointed herself in charge of flowers, with a fierceness that brooked no argument. Ruth spent 3 full weeks on a dress that fit Josie exactly as she was, no corseting, no apologetic tailoring, meant to disguise or diminish, just soft blue cotton, cut, generous, and lovely to fit the body she actually had. And when Josie tried it on for the first time and looked at herself in the mirror, she found she didn't flinch from her own reflection the way she once might have. "You look like a bride," Ruth said quiet from behind her. "Not like a woman trying to look like something she isn't. Just like yourself, only prettier on account of how happy you are." Not everything in those weeks came easy. A letter arrived from the state penitentiary 2 weeks before the wedding, addressed to Josie, in handwriting she recognized with a jolt before she'd even opened the seal. She read it alone, sitting on the porch step, with the evening going gold around her, and found it shorter than she expected, the words plain and unpolished in a way that felt for the first time in all her memory of him entirely honest. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I only wanted you to know I've had a great deal of time in here to think on what my father taught me about wanting things, and none of it was worth learning. I hope Morgan treats you the way I never did. I hope this letter finds you happy, whatever that's worth coming from me. CB. She showed it to Caleb that evening, sitting together on the crate outside the rebuilt forge that had somehow become, without either of them deciding it deliberately, the place where they had their most important conversations. "What do you make of it?" she asked. Caleb read it twice slow before handing it back. "I make of it that a year in a cell has a way of teaching a man things a lifetime of getting whatever he wanted never could. Don't mean I trust him. Don't mean I've forgiven what he tried to do to us, or to your family. But I reckon there's something in a man admitting he was wrong that's worth acknowledging, even from a distance, even from a fella who near burned my whole life down. I don't know how to feel about it." "You don't have to know right away," Caleb said. "Feelings about a thing like that don't always arrive tidy and settled. Sometimes they just arrive messy, and you carry them a while till they sort themselves out." He took her hand, the ring catching the last of the evening light. "For what it's worth, I think it says more about who you've always been than who he's trying to become that a man like that would bother writing you at all. He knew, even doing what he did, that you were the kind of person worth being honest with eventually. Took him burning his whole life down to learn it, but he learned it." Josie folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. Not to answer, not yet. Perhaps not ever, but not to burn either, because some part of her understood that even ugly, hard-won growth deserved to be witnessed rather than erased. Not everything in the days leading up to the wedding went smoothly. 2 days before the ceremony, dark clouds rolled in over Larkspur, thick and low, and by supper time, the whole sky had gone the color of an old bruise, thunder rumbling distant, but unmistakable, threatening to turn the outdoor reception Nettie had planned into a muddy disaster. "We could move it indoors," Thomas offered, watching the sky with a farmer's practiced worry. "Church hall'd hold everybody tight as it'd be." "It won't rain on her wedding day," Nettie said, with the flat, unshakable certainty of a woman who had decided a thing and did not intend to be argued out of it by mere weather. "I won't allow it." Josie, standing at the window watching lightning flicker somewhere out past the church, found herself laughing despite the knot of worry in her own chest. "Nettie, I don't believe you hold quite that much sway over the sky." "We'll see," Nettie said, and stalked off to fuss over flower arrangements, as though daring the clouds to test her. Whatever the truth of Nettie's influence over the heavens, the storm broke overnight and cleared by dawn, leaving the morning washed clean and bright. The grass outside the church, still dew-damp and fragrant, and Nettie, insufferably pleased with herself, spent the whole day reminding anyone who'd listen that she'd told them so. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, the whole town turning out in numbers that made Reverend Hollis joke from the pulpit that he'd need to hold the reception in the street on account of the church never being built to hold quite so many well-wishers at once. Jed Ainsley gave away 3 of his prize hens as a wedding gift, insisting they'd lay finer eggs for a happy household than a sad one. The young girl from the mercantile came with her whole family, wearing a dress her mother had clearly made specially for the occasion, and pressed a small lopsided bouquet of wildflowers into Josie's hands before the ceremony with a shy, proud smile that Josie would remember for the rest of her life. "I picked them myself," the girl said. "Wanted you to have something pretty from somebody who understands what you did for people like us." Josie knelt to hug her, careful not to crush the flowers between them. "You did something for me too, coming to find me that day. Reminded me why standing tall matters, even on the days it's hardest." Ruth walked her down the aisle herself, Thomas on Josie's other arm, both of them handing her forward together in a way that felt to Josie like the truest possible correction of every moment in her life when she'd felt like something to be managed or apologized for, rather than someone to be celebrated. Caleb waited at the front in a coat Ezra had teased him mercilessly for buying new. His hands, Josie noticed trembling slightly, the way they had the night he'd knelt outside the forge, though his eyes never once left her face the whole slow walk up the aisle. "You clean up fine, Morgan," Ezra murmured, standing at his side, as best man and Caleb didn't even glance away from Josie long enough to acknowledge the joke. The vows were simple, unadorned. Exactly the kind of plain, honest words that had first drawn Josie to him weeks before in a smoke-filled shop full of half-finished iron. Reverend Hollis, who had walked with Caleb through more than one hard night since the trial, added his own quiet blessing at the end, looking out over the packed church with an expression of genuine, unhurried satisfaction. "I've married a great many couples in this town over the years," the Reverend said, "but I don't know that I've ever married two people who taught this whole congregation quite so much about what it means to see somebody clearly past what the world tells you to look for first." Larkspur's a kinder town today than it was 3 months ago, and I believe these two are a good part of the reason why. Caleb Morgan, Josephine Calloway, I now pronounce you man and wife. The cheer that went up when Caleb kissed her nearly took the roof off the church, or so Nettie insisted for months afterward, embellishing the story a little further each time she told it, until in her retelling, half the county had wept openly, and even Sheriff Doyle, not known for sentiment, had been seen wiping his eyes with his hat. The reception spilled out across the church green, under a sky so clear it seemed to be making up for its bad temper 2 nights before, long tables groaning under more food than even Larkspur's considerable appetite could finish fiddles, tuning up as the afternoon wore toward evening. Ezra stood to give his toast with a cup of cider raised high and an expression that suggested he'd been rehearsing this particular speech for weeks. "I've known Caleb Morgan going on 4 years now," Ezra said, "and in all that time, I never once heard the man complain about the hand life dealt him. Not about his brother, not about riding drag instead of point that night. Not about a single lonely supper he ate by himself in that little house behind the forge. Man kept his grief tucked away so tidy most folks in this town figured he didn't have any at all." He looked at Caleb and something thick and sincere crept into his voice. Watching him finally let somebody in, watching him choose to be happy instead of just careful, has been about the finest thing I've witnessed in this town. Bar none. Josie, you didn't just marry a good man. You gave a good man permission to stop punishing himself for surviving. To Caleb and Josie Morgan. The whole green raised their cups, and Josie, blinking back tears for what felt like the 10th time that day, found Caleb's hand under the table and held on tight while the fiddles struck up the first dance, and half the town, it seemed, lined up to take a turn, spinning the bride around the green before the night was through. Life afterward did not transform overnight into some flawless, effortless idyll. Josie would have distrusted a story that claimed it had, but it settled steady and true into something neither of them had quite dared imagine for themselves before that terrible, wonderful summer. Not every day of that first married year came easy. Some mornings, catching her own reflection in the small mirror Caleb had hung by the washstand, Josie found the old voices creeping back in uninvited. Colt's voice, Prudence's voice, years of careful cutting remarks that didn't simply vanish because a good man had finally chosen her plain and whole. One such morning, weeks into the marriage, she stood a long while in front of that mirror with her hands pressed flat against her own middle, turning sideways, studying herself with an old familiar critical eye she'd thought she'd left behind on Main Street the day she refused Colt Bryant's ring. Caleb found her there and didn't say anything at first, just came and stood behind her, resting his chin lightly against the top of her head, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror's reflection. "What are you looking for?" he asked, gentle. "I don't rightly know," Josie admitted. "Some old habit, I suppose. Some days the town's voice gets quieter and quieter in my head, and other days it comes back loud as ever, and I hate that it still has that kind of power over me even now, even happy as I am." Caleb turned her gently to face him instead of the glass. "Old habits don't disappear just 'cause a person's happier than they used to be, Josie. Grief over Daniel didn't disappear the day I met you either. It just got quieter, made room for other things alongside it." He tipped her chin up with 2 careful fingers. "You're allowed to still be working on believing what I know plain and true about you. I ain't going anywhere while you do the working. I love you." She said simple, because it was the truest thing she had to offer him in that moment. "I know it," he said, and kissed her forehead and the old voice that morning at least went quiet again. Word reached them near the end of that first year that Colt Bryant had been released early for good behavior and had taken work of all things on a ranch 2 counties over, mending fence-breaking horses. The kind of honest, unglamorous labor his father's money had always let him avoid before. A second letter came not long after, shorter even than the first, addressed to Caleb this time rather than Josie. Heard you rebuilt bigger than before. Glad of it. I ain't the same man who set that fire, and I don't expect you to believe that on my word alone, but I mean to spend a good long while proving it true regardless. CB. Caleb read it once, folded it carefully, and set it in the same drawer where Josie kept her own letter, neither of them speaking of forgiveness exactly, but both of them understanding without needing to say it aloud that some doors were worth leaving unlocked, even when you had no plans to walk back through them yourself. Silas Bryant, for his part, was never seen in Larkspur again after his release. Word came second-hand and unconfirmed that he'd settled somewhere near Galveston, working as a clerk for wages far smaller than he'd ever imagined for himself, and Josie found she spared him little thought at all. Some reckonings, she'd come to understand, didn't require witnessing to be complete. The forge itself thrived through all of it. Word of the trial had traveled well beyond Larkspur's borders, and Caleb found himself with more business than he'd ever had before. Silas Bryant's scheme's customers riding in from 3 counties over, specifically requesting the blacksmith who'd stood up to a corrupt banker and won. Josie worked alongside him most days now, her early crooked hooks long since given way to work steady and fine enough that customers occasionally asked for her by name rather than his. A fact that never once seemed to trouble Caleb's pride, only fill him with a kind of open, unguarded satisfaction that Josie treasured more than she knew how to say. You're better at the delicate work than I ever was, he told her one afternoon, watching her finish a set of hinges with flowers worked into the metal, a skill she'd learned from watching him make her very first gift all those months before. Reckon I taught you everything I know, and you went and improved on it. I had a good teacher, she said, echoing the very first thing she'd ever told him in that shop. And the smile that crossed his face told her he remembered it too. Ruth visited most weeks, no longer out of nervous obligation, but genuine pleasure, often bringing preserves or bread, and staying long past when the errand required. And one autumn afternoon, she arrived with news of her own, a letter from her sister in Georgia, whom she hadn't spoken to in over a decade, following some old small-town falling out. Neither woman had ever fully explained extending an invitation to visit, now that Ruth had, in her own words, remembered what it felt like to want things loudly again. I have you to thank for that, I think, Ruth told her daughter, sitting in the shade outside the forge while Josie worked. Watching you stand up for what you wanted, even when the whole town told you not to, reminded me I'd spent 30 years apologizing for wanting anything at all. I'm done apologizing, Josephine. Your father and I are going to visit my sister come spring. I'm glad, Mama. So am I, Ruth said, and meant it with her whole worn, softened heart. Prudence Sutter's transformation came slower and more grudgingly than Ruth's, but it came all the same. She never became a close friend, never quite lost the sharp edge that had always defined her, but she stopped entirely. The casual cruelty that had once seemed to flow from her as naturally as breathing. And once unprompted, she stood up at a church social and corrected a newcomer to town who'd made an unkind remark about another woman's size, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had learned a hard lesson and had no intention of watching it go unlearned by somebody else. We don't talk that way about our neighbors here, Prudence said flat final, and the newcomer, chastened, apologized on the spot. Josie heard about it secondhand from Nettie and found herself laughing until she cried, not from any lingering resentment, but from the sheer unlikely wonder of watching a town remake itself, slowly and perfectly, one corrected assumption at a time. By the following spring, Josie found herself standing in the doorway of the forge one warm morning, watching Caleb work, one hand pressed low against her own middle, in a gesture that had become in recent weeks almost unconscious. And when he caught her watching, he set down his tools entirely, crossing to her with a question plain on his face before she'd said a single word. You're certain? He asked, low, careful, like the words themselves might be fragile enough to break something precious if handled wrong. Doc Ellis confirmed it yesterday. Josie took his hand and pressed it gently against her middle. watching his face transform, watching every last careful, guarded piece of the quiet man she'd first met in a smoke-filled shop dissolve entirely into something open and unguarded and radiant. "Come winter, Caleb Morgan, you're going to be a father." He didn't say anything for a long moment, and when he finally did speak, his voice had gone rough in the particular way she'd come to recognize as the sound of him feeling something too large for plain words to properly hold. "I used to think I'd used up all my luck the day I carried my brother home," he said quiet. "Told myself for years a man only gets so much good fortune in one life, and I'd already spent mine wrong standing 50 yards off when it mattered. Didn't believe for the longest while that I'd ever get to feel like this again, like the world had more good waiting for me than grief. And now I reckon I was wrong about a great many things," Caleb said, pulling her close, his hand still resting warm and careful against her middle. "Same as this whole town was wrong about you, Josie, the day they decided your size made you worth less than you are. Turns out being wrong and admitting it and building something better out of the wreckage that might be the most honest thing a person can do with a hard-won life." Their daughter was born the following winter in the small house behind the rebuilt forge, with Ruth and Nettie both present, and Thomas pacing a groove into the porch outside, despite everyone's assurances that everything was proceeding exactly as it should. Caleb paced right alongside him for the better part of an hour before Ruth finally took pity and let him back inside. And when he reached Josie's side, his face gray with worry, she found the strength, even through the exhausting work of it, to laugh at him. "You look worse than I feel," she managed between breaths. "I don't rightly know what to do with my hands when I can't fix the thing that's hurting you," Caleb admitted, gripping hers instead, careful and desperate at once. "Just hold on," Josie told him. "That's all I need from you right now. Just hold on and don't let go." He didn't let go, not once, through all the long hours that followed. And when their daughter finally arrived, small and furious and impossibly loud for something so new to the world, Ruth placed her into Josie's arms first, before anyone else was permitted to hold her, tears streaming freely down a face that had once been so careful never to show weakness in front of her own daughter. "She's got your stubbornness already," Ruth said, laughing and crying together, hollering like she means to be heard the first time and every time after. They named her Daniela after the brother Caleb had carried 2 miles through the dark and never stopped honoring. And when Caleb held his daughter for the first time, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot still smudged along his jaw. From a morning's work he hadn't had time to wash off before rushing to her side, he looked down at her small, furious red face and said, so quiet only Josie heard it, that he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure she never once doubted, for a single day, that she was exactly enough just as she was, same as her mother had finally learned to believe about herself. "She's beautiful," Caleb said, wonder plain in his voice. "She's ours," Josie said, and found no better words existed to hold the whole of what that meant. Ezra, standing in the doorway with a grin he made no effort to hide, cleared his throat until both new parents looked up. "Don't mean to intrude on the moment, but I figured you two ought to know. I've asked Nettie to walk out with me come Sunday, and she said yes, so it appears this whole business of falling in love against everybody's better judgment has become something of a habit in this town lately." "About time," Josie said, laughing, despite her exhaustion. "I was beginning to think the two of you would circle each other clean into old age before either one worked up the nerve." "Wasn't nerve I was short on," Ezra said, tipping his hat toward the new baby. "Just needed a bit of proof first that choosing somebody plain and honest, storms and all, was worth the risk. You two gave me that proof whether you meant to or not." He left them to their small, exhausted family, and Josie looked down at her daughter's sleeping face, then up at her husband's, soot-streaked and radiant, and thought that no fortune Colt Bryant's family had ever possessed could have purchased a single moment of what she held now freely given and entirely, unshakably real. Years later, when people asked Josie Morgan how she'd come to marry the quiet blacksmith instead of the golden cowboy, the whole town once swore would win her heart. She told it plain, the way she told most things, without embellishment or apology. "A cowboy asked for my hand in the middle of Main Street once in front of half this county, expecting me to be grateful he'd noticed me at all," she'd say. "I looked past him, all the way down the street to a man who'd never once made a show of caring about me because he didn't need an audience to prove it was real. I chose the man who saw me plain in the daylight without needing the whole town to agree with him first. Best decision I ever made, and I'd make it again in a heartbeat, every single time. The Forge still stands in Larkspur to this day, in the stories folks tell each other on quiet evenings, rebuilt twice over the years as the town itself grew up around it, but never once losing the small, careful flower worked into every gate, hinge, and horseshoe that left Caleb Morgan's hands. His own quiet signature, folks came to understand, marking every truly precious thing he ever made iron, or otherwise as worth keeping. And that, more than any fortune or any name this county ever offered, was the whole of what Josephine Calloway had wanted all along, not to be chosen, despite who she was, but simply plainly to be seen and found in the end, entirely worth the choosing.